Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This is Beth Galella from Bristol Myers Squibb, and I'm a member of the IQ Pediatric Working Group. On behalf of the working group, I'm happy to have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Harry Sachs today. Dr. Sachs graduated from the University of Maryland School of Medicine and completed her residency training at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. after 14 years in pediatric practice. After 14 years in pediatric practice, Dr. Sachs joined the FDA in 2002 at a time of significant progress in pediatric drug development. She advocated for studying drugs in all age groups that could benefit while guarding the safety of children involved in research. Throughout her career at the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Sachs was involved in adding pediatric labeling information to hundreds of drugs and biological products, as well as in efforts to improve labeling for drugs used during lactation. All the while, Dr. Sachs continued caring for children in outpatient pediatric practice, which enabled her to provide clinical expertise and perspective to new regulatory efforts. Dr. Sachs retired in late February 2020 after 18 years at the FDA and 32 years in clinical practice. So I would also like to add that after we conclude today's webinar, you will receive an email from Mahalea with a feedback survey. It's very important for us to ensure that these webinars are beneficial and valuable to our audience, so we do appreciate your feedback. And also, if anyone in the pediatric community has interest in presenting at this forum, please feel free to reach out to myself or David Tan. And thank you. I would like to turn it over to Dr. Sachs.
Thank you, Beth, for that kind introduction. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Today I'm going to Today I'm going to discuss the types of pediatric formulations that I think are particularly useful in pediatric practice that make it easier for patients to take their medication, and it's not just about liquids anymore. A few disclaimers. These are my personal opinions, and I'm not speaking for anybody. I have consulted for several pharmaceutical companies since I retired from FDA. Throughout the presentation, I will be using brand names as well as generics, because you'll see it'll become confusing if I refer only to the generics. And I've abstracted much of the information that you'll see on a pediatric program from publicly available reviews on the product. So obviously there's nothing proprietary in this talk, and I may not have as much details about some of the formulations as you guys would like, but I will do my best. So first, I'm going to discuss some general principles that guide pediatric drug development today, including the ethical considerations that might impact testing new formulations, and the potential use of pediatric extrapolation, which does affect the scope of the programs. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the two major pediatric regulations, BPCA and PREA, focusing on their requirement with respect to formulation development. And I'm going to review, for the bulk of the presentation, many of the new formulations that were developed as a result of these pediatric initiatives, with some representative examples of programs that illustrate the complexity of getting a new product approved and the challenges of formulation development. So when I first started seeing patients back in 1987, if I wanted to use a particular treatment, I would rarely find information in what was then the drug label available in the PDR. So I would call up a friend and treat the patient based on what they said. I mean, clearly that's very anecdotal and not optimal. Even when I joined FDA in 2002, pediatric drug development was generally an afterthought, and pediatric programs really didn't start until after a drug was approved in adults. But luckily for clinicians today, the prevailing principles are that pediatric patients should have access to therapies that have been appropriately evaluated for their use, and developmental programs should include pediatric patients when use is anticipated in the age group. And therefore, planning for pediatric studies very early is essential, including assessing the age group that's the appropriate target, and once that is established, working on formulation development and supportive juvenile tox if necessary. And since formulations in adults are usually appropriate for adolescents and dosing is predictable, consider including pediatric adolescents in adult efficacy trials and planning to initiate pediatric studies as soon as possible. And that's critically important because there's still a fairly big time lag between adult approval and approval in pediatrics, which results in off-label use. Now, because children cannot consent for themselves, there are special ethical considerations, and they really can only be enrolled in a clinical trial when the scientific question cannot be answered in a population like adults that can consent for themselves. And so unless the use of the product, the experimental product, offers a direct benefit to the patient or the subject enrolled, the risk of the trial needs to be relatively low, in quotes, and participation cannot expose a patient in a trial to excessive risks or deprive them of alternative treatments that might be the standard of care. And so what do those ethical considerations mean for formulation development? In general, bioavailability and bioequivalence studies typically should not be performed in the pediatric population. They should be performed in adults. And in addition, an otherwise healthy child should not be enrolled in PK studies. Instead, pediatric patients with the condition of interest should be selected, although there is certainly the potential to enroll an at-risk population when that population is not available. So, or it's not practical. So for example, one can enroll otherwise healthy children who are at risk for a common cold in a common cold study for a new drug that would be intended to treat that, who are at risk by virtue of their exposure. You can enroll someone with migraines in a study who's not actively having a migraine. And as I mentioned, an important consideration for the scope of a program is the type of trial that's needed to support approval in pediatric patients, is whether or not efficacy can be extrapolated from adults or an older pediatric population. Now, I like to think that extrapolation is a hypothesis that if a drug works in adults, it's likely to work in children. But in order for extrapolation to be considered, efficacy actually has to already be established in adults or another pediatric population. The disease course and pathophysiology needs to be similar between the two populations, and the response to treatment needs to be similar. So the type of evidence or pediatric study that would be necessary to support extrapolation of efficacy depends on the confidence that if a drug works in adults, it's likely to work with kids. And so if there's a high level of certainty, then we say that full extrapolation is appropriate. That means PK and safety would be the information that needs to be gathered. In contrast, if there's not an adult population from which to extrapolate, or the confidence is low, like take depression, where we know there's a lot of failed trials, the pediatric program must stand alone. In other words, a full developmental program. I'd like to point out that actually dosing and safety cannot be fully extrapolated, but you can leverage data from other populations. For example, modeling and simulation, as you know, has been increasingly used to predict pediatric dosing. That dosing, though, does have to be confirmed in a study. And safety experience from other indications where exposure is similar can also be leveraged. And now that more information has been gathered in pediatric patients for various conditions, especially when there's multiple drug classes or drugs available, the approach to pediatric extrapolation has evolved. And so, for example, there's been changes in how we think about it. When I started, there were all these trials for schizophrenia, but now schizophrenia in adolescents can be extrapolated fully from adults. There was also a huge analysis several years ago about the seizure products, And now full extrapolation is acceptable for certain seizure types, partial onset seizures, in patients 2 years and older. Okay, I'm going to switch gears and talk about the pediatric regulations. So, as y'all know, pediatric patients often suffered from mishaps from getting drugs that prompt all the regulations that led to FDA's requirements related to purity and efficacy and safety. But, you know, there really was not too much to encourage pediatric drug development until the advent of the two pediatric regulations, BPCA and PREA. And I recognize now there are new regulations that encourage the study of orphan products and rare diseases, but I'm actually not going to talk about them right now as there's less experience with approvals from them. I'm just going to stick to BPCA and PREA, which of course is what I know best. So the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, or also the CARET, incentivizes pediatric studies and establishes a voluntary process that sponsors that conduct studies according to a pediatric written request can potentially receive 6 months of marketing exclusivity. They do have to have a written request. The studies need to be conducted according to the outline of the written request, but they do not have to be positive. They could be negative or inconclusive as long as they are within the scope of the written request. And for formulation development, if a formulation is studied under this process and gets exclusivity, but is not introduced within the market, is not introduced into the market within a year of that exclusivity, that information is publicly posted. And I'm pleased to say there's really a few of these. There's only like 7 as of yesterday. So considering the number of written requests that have been issued, that's pretty cool. BPCA also established a collaborative process between FDA and NIH to study some of the older or off-patent drugs. Now, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, PREA, or the STIC, requires certain drugs to be studied when they're submitted. And PREA is triggered for any new indication, new active ingredient, that's like a new salt or say a new combination, a new dosing regimen, so going from twice a day to once a day, a new route of administration, that one seems obvious, and a new dosage form. PREA requires the development of an age-appropriate formulation for the relevant age group. And while pediatric studies can be partially waived, that means not required, in a given age group if a sponsor cannot develop that age-appropriate formulation. Only a few waivers have been granted for that reason. The bar is actually relatively high. Attempts have to be made and documented, and that information is also publicly posted. And as of yesterday, I think there were 6. So not a lot. So just to quickly compare and contrast BPCA and PREA, the carrot and the stick, both regulations apply to drugs and biologics. Under BPCA, the studies are voluntary while they are required under PREA. PREA only applies to the targeted indication that's going for approval, while the scope of BPCA is broader, and it might include unapproved indications as well as the approved indications and orphan or rare diseases. But products with orphan designation, except for certain oncologic products, are exempt from PREA. And importantly, the results of pediatric studies that were conducted in response to either a PREA PMR, post-marketing requirement, or BPCA written request must be included in labeling, whether these results are positive, negative, or inconclusive once the program is complete. So PREA requires that planning for a pediatric program starts early in development, and an initial pediatric study plan, which outlines the general program plan, including the formulation development, must be submitted 60 days after an end of phase 2 meeting before phase 3 studies are initiated. Excuse me. And you can see the general outline of an IPSP on this slide. In the formulation section, sponsors are supposed to describe the pediatric formulations that are planned, including the quantitative composition, of the product, including excipients. And helpful information to include is the size of any solid dosage form, capsule or tablet, to see if a patient could swallow it, and description of the drug delivery system, like an associated device, the size of a nose prong, for example, for intranasal product, or the size of a needle, for example, for an auto-injectable. And the timeline for pediatric formulation development should be noted in section 11. So these pediatric regulations have been hugely successful in my mind. There's over 900 labeling changes for a variety of indications, and there's been many new oral formulations, new types of oral formulations, as well as products that can be administered from alternate routes, such as intranasally or transdermally. And while devices per se cannot be administered, they're not subject to PREA or BPCA. Certain drug or device combinations do trigger PREA, and several off-patent devices have been developed in response to the, several devices have been developed in response to the BPCA off-patent process. So here is a list that illustrates some of the variety of new oral formulations that have been developed because of these initiatives. And the list is not all-inclusive. I actually picked examples of new formulations that were included in examples of pediatric labeling changes from the AAP News FDA update articles that were published over the past 5 to 6 years. But you can see there are many types of new oral formulations in addition to the more traditional solutions and suspensions, many of which now are extended release, which afford once-a-day dosing. There are now chewables, pellets, orally disintegrating tablets, a dissolving film, and even a 3D printed tablet. And many of the new oral products that have been approved over the years are for diseases I'd see every day: allergy, attention deficit disorder, seizures. But some of them are for less common pediatric indications where there wasn't existing pediatric therapies, such as ivabradine for pediatric heart failure or dabigatran for thromboembolism. And I'll talk a little more about mirabegron for neurogenic bladder. So in the next slides, I'll discuss few representative examples of new oral formulations that I think have been helpful and some of the challenges in their development, starting with a granule for oral suspension, Mirbatic, and then a chewable, Quilachew, and an orally disintegrating tablet, lamotrigine or Lamictal ODT. So let me start with the granule. So when I picked this product to discuss, I have to admit that I didn't appreciate the distinction between an oral granule and a granule for suspension. So for my own review, a granule for oral suspension is intended to be added to water and then administered in some period of time, as opposed to an oral granule that's administered directly, that is swallowed or sprinkled on a vehicle. So you'll learn something new every day. Anyway, so Mirbatric or mirabegron extended release tablets were originally approved for overactive bladder in adults. And at the time of approval, the sponsor was issued a PREA requirement for what was thought to be the analogous pediatric indication, neurogenic detrusor activity or neurogenic bladder, NDO, in patients 3 years and older. And these are patients that have congenital problems like spina bifida or spinal cord injury and require treatment with chronic intermittent catheterization, as well as anticholinergics or intravesicular injections. And because those treatments are not so pleasant, the thought was they would benefit from a product with a different mechanism of action. And so this sponsor got a written request for those studies. And in response to that written request, they developed this granule formulation for oral suspension. And you might recognize that the approval of the new dosage form did trigger PREA. So there was a typo on my original slides. These are BPCA and PREA studies. But because when the information was submitted in response to the written request, the product could be adequately labeled in the relevant age group, and there was no additional studies required. And approval in the patients 3 years and older was based on clinically meaningful increases in urodynamics, including maximal systometric capacity in an open label study. And it was supported also by diary measurements of leakage and bladder volume. And the magnitude of treatment effect was similar across all age groups, and that permitted the approval. So not only does this represent a new option for patients based on the mechanism of action, the development of an extended release formulation requiring once daily dosing that improves compliance is attractive. The formulation development program seems pretty extensive to me in that 3 extended release granule forms were studied, prototypes. One was a granule reconstituted extemporaneously. One was with water, and then finally what became the to-be marketed formulation, the higher concentration granule that afforded lower dosing volumes, was made, and that was the formulation studied in the pediatric open label studies. But to identify this formulation and support approval, there was several bioequivalent studies to bridge the two formulations, this oral formulation and the reference listed tablets approved in adults. So now let's look at a program for a chewable. When you treat young patients with ADHD in particular, they don't sometimes swallow tablets, and they sometimes won't want to take a liquid. So a chewable is kind of a nice formulation. The Quillachew ER is a methylphenidate approved for attention deficit disorder in patients 6 years and older. The sponsor actually had intended to establish bioequivalence to their approved oral suspension that was also extended release, that was Coolevent XR, but that could not be done. More on this in a moment. And so a full efficacy study was required, and what the sponsor did was did a double-blind, placebo-controlled classroom efficacy study in school-age kids 6 to 12, and that was positive and allowed approval in that age group, and then efficacy from that study was extrapolated to adolescents. The new dosage form triggers PREA, and so currently there actually is an outstanding PREA PMR for clinical efficacy and safety studies in patients 4 to 5 years of age. A PK study in that age group has been finished. So what was involved to develop this formulation? Well, several prototype formulations were tested in an attempt to establish bioequivalence with the sponsor's own extended release product. It also supported whether or not the tablets could be administered by chewing or swallowing. But when bioequivalence couldn't be established, what became the to-be marketed formulation was used in a study to establish a link with a different reference listed product, methylene chewables, and in a study that also assessed food effect. And in a nutshell, these VE studies showed that there was some lower exposures for prototypes in the early phase AUC compared to Coolevent XR, and there were different time concentration curves compared with the methylene chewable. And so based on these PK differences, the clinical response would be different if you switched between products, and that was why the clinical trial had to be done. And the clinical trial needed to also make sure that the time to onset of effect and the duration of effect would be acceptable. So lastly, I'm going to discuss the development of an oral disintegrating tablet using Lamictal ODT as an example. And an ODT, per guidance, is something that disintegrates and grows rapidly in the oral cavity with an in vitro time of 30 seconds or less to disintegrate. I don't think that's written in stone. If it was 31, I'm not sure that would be a problem. Anyway, lamotrigine is indicated for several epilepsy indications, as you see. Efficacy was not established in pediatric bipolar disorder for earlier PREA studies, but the approval of the ODT as a new dosage form triggered PREA, and it was based on establishing bioequivalence to the immediate release lamotrigine product. And in order for this formulation to be developed, taste masking and flavoring was required to offset the bitter taste of lamotrigine. And the developmental program consisted of PK and safety studies, which compared to the previous product seems a little more straightforward to me. 2 PK studies were performed, a pilot comparing 2 potential ODT formulations to the immediate release lamotrigine, followed by a bioequivalence trial of what was selected as the to be marketed ODT that it also evaluated food effects. There had to be a local safety study in approximately 200 adults to look at what happened in the mouth. And the sponsor did provide some additional safety information on one of the inactive ingredients. So now I'm going to move away from oral therapies and discuss a few products administered by different routes, starting with Daytrana. And Daytrana is another methylphenidate. This one's a transdermal system, an adhesive-based matrix patch that's approved for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in patients 6 years and older. And this also, as a new route, triggers PREA. The approval was based on an extensive clinical program, multiple PK studies, placebo-controlled classroom efficacy studies that enrolled approximately 200 school-age kids, and 2 long-term safety studies in over 450 pediatric subjects. Dermal tolerability and skin irritation was assessed as part of this program. The formulation program also was extensive with non-clinical dermal tox and CAR-C studies, several single and multiple dose PK studies in adults to assess the relative exposure compared with oral methylphenidate products, bioavailability at different application sites like the scapula or in the hip, the impact of applying the product under heat, or to inflame skin, and of course, because it's a stimulant, the abuse potential. And what those studies showed was the relative exposure is actually higher with the transdermal product than the oral, even though there's a lag to the time to onset. That was kind of mitigated by the long-term safety studies, and of course, in the clinical setting, you can apply the patch before the kid goes to school and take care of that lag. One problem is there is residual methylphenidate in the discarded patches, up to 2/3, which could pose a abuse misuse potential. So that's something that I think there was a PMR about. But nonetheless, the risk benefit was considered acceptable for patients who cannot comply with oral therapy. And even though you'd expect some higher exposures, these patients are typically monitored for adverse events like insomnia and appetite suppression and tachycardia or hypertension. Now, as an aside, a residual drug and other patches, particularly opiates, which at this point transdermal forms are not approved in children, do pose a risk for pediatric patients. Thus, proper storage and disposal are important, and there are packaging requirements for these products. Now, I mentioned that there is a labeling requirement related to pediatric studies performed under PREA or BPCA, regardless of their findings, positive, inconclusive, or negative. And 2 unsuccessful transdermal programs related to PREA requirements, Butrans for chronic pain, and an adolescent program for Salonpas, which is temporary relief of musculoskeletal pain, illustrate how information can be incorporated in labeling in these circumstances where information is either insufficient or the program is unsuccessful. So there was not actually enough information gathered for Butrans to support approval, although the study that was outlined was considered sufficient to fulfill the PREA requirements at the time. And so the labeling states under section 8.4, pediatric use, the safety and efficacy of Butrans in patients under 18 years of age has not been established. Butrans has been evaluated in an open label clinical trial in pediatric patients. However, definitive conclusions are not possible because of the small sample size. Similarly, when the pediatric studies for Salon passed and the adolescents came in, that was not successful. So it was deemed reasonable that it met that PREA requirement, and actually a PREA requirement for younger children was released. But labeling for this product, which is over the counter, states children under 18 do not use. This product has not been shown to work in children. That was a little bit of a challenge because the real estate in the OTC setting is a little less than in the prescription setting. And just to complete the circle, of course, if the drugs are approved in pediatric patients, I would always comment that the information is sprinkled throughout the labeling as appropriate, not only in the indication section, in the PK section, clinical trial section, etc., as well as 8.4 pediatric use. Okay, now I'm going to look at yet another route of administration through the nose. Now, there's been 2 new nasal products approved under PREA that I think are particularly useful in the emergency setting. I'll talk a little more about the glucagon product, but also there's a Narcan, naloxone hydrochloride, for emergency treatment of known or suspected opioid overdose. And these are important products because they can be used by patients, by caregivers or bystanders at home or at school. And again, those are PREA studies. Let's look a little more closely at the program for Baqsimi, glucagon, nasal powder. Now, this approval represents both, triggers and PREA because it's a new dosage form and route. And the existing approved products at the time were injectables that all required reconstitution. The clinical program was pretty extensive, 5 efficacy studies in patients with diabetes. 3 of these were studies that assessed the glucagon intranasal's impact on glucose after an insulin-induced hypoglycemia. And 2 of these were real-world studies that assessed the clinical success of giving intranasal glucagon in patients who were experiencing hypoglycemia outside, like at home or school. And one each of these studies, one efficacy and one real use study, was conducted in pediatric patients with type 1 diabetes. Sorry. And the efficacy studies in adults for glucose looked at the effect of glucagon on blood sugar, and the blood sugar had to increase to a pre-specified target or increase to a certain level within 30 minutes of glucagon administration. The pediatric study actually looked at PK and glucose response, and that permitted a post hoc analysis to show that the increase to that level over 20 milligrams above baseline was similar. They didn't allow the kids to get the target because they didn't let them go so low. And then the real world studies looked at the proportion of patients that were awake or returned to their normal status, and that these were positive, so the product could be approved. Now, from a formulation standpoint, this program also was pretty complex and required non-clinical testing to support the safety of the inactive ingredients, including a novel excipient. There were 2 confirmatory dose selection studies, including one study that bridged the PK with the to-be-marketed formulation and the intramuscular product. There were 4 supporting dose-finding studies. One of these was in kids using the experimental formulation. And there was also a trial in adults with cold symptoms to assess the impact of nasal congestion on absorption. And these studies showed that the intranasal form was rapidly absorbed in all ages, reaching maximum concentration within 15 minutes. And the glucose followed close behind. On average, it increased within 16 minutes. In contrast, in the injectable route, it's about 12. Although there is a delay, about 1 to 4 minutes from the intranasal route compared with the injectable, that's considered acceptable because if you are recognizing hypoglycemia in someone, you have to get the injectable and then reconstitute it, and that takes some time as well. Of note, a weight-based dosing was not required when body weight allometry was performed. Age and gender didn't impact the PK in all the pediatric patients, so a 3 milligram dose could be used in all age group. And there is a margin of safety if the 3 milligrams is not absorbed in its entirety. Okay, so switching gears once again, I'd like to briefly talk about devices. Talking a little more about AUVI-Q, which is an auto-injector that's indicated for the treatment of anaphylaxis in infants and toddlers as well as older kids, and mention several new pediatric devices that I think are kind of interesting. Many pediatric drugs, as you know, are dosed by body weight, but in an emergency setting, we don't know the weight of a child, and we may guess. But two body weight estimators, the Mercy tape and Mercy baby tape, were developed as part of the BPCA off-patent process through studies funded by NIH. And these devices provide a better way to estimate weight in an emergency setting and calculate a dose. And as an alternative to pharmaceuticals, I know that might be sacrilegious here, EndeavorRx is a game-based digital device to improve attention in 8 years and older. Who knew video games could help patients with ADD? And diabetes has a new tech, MiniMed 770G system that automatically adjusts background insulin therapy via a smartphone in patients with type 1 diabetes. That's kind of cool. All right, so here's the example of a new advance for pediatrics triggered by PREA. AUVI-Q, it's a drug device that's indicated for emergency treatment of allergic reactions, including anaphylaxis. This is something that can be used at home. It comes with directions. And for a long time, there are products that have had approved dosing regimens for patients over 15 kilograms. And they were available. As you know, there was one that went in short supply though. But now there's a product that's available for infants and toddlers, which is great. It's a new dosing regimen of 0.1 milligrams, and that in itself triggers PREA. Approval of this new dose did not require a clinical trial. It was based on supportive information from the literature and the existing experience, as well as a sonographic study that showed that the shorter needle length was safe. And to differentiate the products, it's easy to tell because there's a different color scheme for each dose. So in the past 40 minutes or so, I've provided a brief snapshot of the new formulations that have been successfully and maybe not so successfully developed in response to the pediatric initiatives. Many of these formulations have provided easier ways to administer medications. Others can be dosed less frequency, and several can be administered to a patient in the emergency setting or a patient who is unwilling or unable to swallow a product. I've described a range of clinical programs, some of which involve standalone pediatric trials and full developmental programs, while others relied on full extrapolation, that is, PK and safety studies, with support from adults. Efficacy, I've also described a range of complexity for the studies required to support formulation development and establish bioequivalence to existing products. I'm certainly convinced that developing a pediatric formulation is no small task and requires a lot of planning and hard work. Nevertheless, is critically important. But there's one pediatric population who poses a particular problem for formulation development as well as clinical studies, and that is neonates and preterm infants. And administering a product to this population is particularly challenging because if you give too much volume, for example, to one of these patients, you actually can screw up their nutrition or body salts. If you make it real concentrated and then it might be tough to measure accurately. And of course, these guys are really prone to toxicity from inactive ingredients. However, given the progress that I've seen with all the novel formulations developed thus far in children, and since BPCA and PREA, and with the new initiatives too that are coming, I'm confident that there will be many more formulations for neonates and preterm infants in the future. I thank you for your attention, and I hope everyone has a happy holiday. I am happy to attempt to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sachs, for that wonderful presentation. Very informative.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions here. One is, question for the PREA rep. If you develop a QD-ER formulation that is not acceptable to dose to pediatrics, but you have a BID pediatric formulation, is that okay, or are you required to also develop a QD formulation?
So again, you can get a waiver for developing a once-a-day formulation that would be considered like the age-appropriate formulation, let's say, if you show that you've attempted to do it and failed. Because a once-a-day formulation might still be considered a public health benefit. It does depend, though, what else is out there for your formulation. So it may be a question to ask of the division, but I would guess it would be considered a benefit, and you would actually have to show you tried and failed.
Okay, thank you. Can you please comment on bridging between adult and pediatric formulations under both fasting and fed conditions, particularly when the food effect is not deemed clinically relevant in adults?
I'm not sure how to answer that question, because that's, the bioequivalence part of things is not my area of expertise. But in general, if again, if for some reason there was some thought that the food effect in kids was much greater than adults, then studies could be performed in a child. But if the question can be answered in adults, it should be answered in adults.
Okay, thank you. Are mini tablets also accepted for newborns? If yes, is there a limit regarding the numbers?
I don't think that's been established. I actually looked hard to see if I could find any example mini tablets that were approved in the US. I know there's some in Europe. And so I don't know that there's limits. I think it would be something that would be tested as part of the developmental program.
Okay, thank you. By the way, lots of comments saying great presentation.
Oh, that's so nice.
Great presentation. At the end you mentioned 2 new initiatives. Can you elaborate?
Oh, I'm talking about the rare disease vouchers and the pediatric orphan initiatives. And they came about kind of toward the end of my tenure. So I'll be honest, I'm not as familiar with them. But I think actually will become quite useful.
Okay. Is there an agency expectation to develop mini tablets / oral granules, as we know interchangeably, specifically designated for reconstitution as drug device combination product, or can sponsor develop it for use with commonly available household or pharmacy devices?
I do not have any experience with that one.
Okay, all right. Can you give any insight on any FDA-approved literatures to find if a certain excipient is allowed to be used in pediatric patients? So I guess resources.
So, so there's a publicly available and active ingredient database. And then I know that there's obviously been work on an active ingredient database. I haven't looked at that in the past year or so, but you can look up that database. It's at least, I'll admit, the last time I looked at the one at FDA, it tells you what has been used, but it doesn't really tell you like enough information to figure out if that product is approved in kids, which I think would be very helpful. So I know it's something that the agency was working on. I have a feeling it's something that, because of COVID, has not been the priority, unfortunately.
Okay, are you referring to the STEP database?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Okay, I have one more question so far. This person is interested in excipients which are accepted in pediatric formulations. I guess similar question. Can you comment on current data, further development and activities? I guess that's sort of similar to the last question. I don't know if you have any additional.
Right. I mean, yeah, basically, I know that there's a lot of interest in that. And I was kind of hoping that this STEP database would be real helpful.
Okay, thank you. I had one question actually on the granule formulation that you were referring to. You mentioned, I guess that in describing that it was there were I guess 3 formulation types. One dosed in a vehicle. Were these granules dosed in food or liquid? Is that?
So that's the distinction between the granules for oral suspension, is that the way this one is, you actually can dilute it to a fairly big volume at home. I think it's a couple hundred milliliters. But most of them, I think, were such that you would put it in a teaspoon of liquid and then give it to the patient, and so the labeling will outline how much volume it can be dispersed in.
Okay.
If it's actually an oral granule, that's the one that gets tested with different vehicles like applesauce or formula.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I was actually getting at whether on the label, whether it was specifically mentioned what may be used or what may not be used. That's what I was. Okay, I think that's all the questions I have. So again, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I know you're retired. I really appreciate you coming and joining this webinar series to share your knowledge from an FDA perspective.
Well, I was very happy to do so. I had actually a lot of fun doing this presentation. So thank you for all your attention and help.